Welcome to Ruined by the Internet. I'm Gareth King. Today we're asking, has the internet ruined our ability to find common ground? It promised a place where people from diverse backgrounds could find connection and understanding. Instead, it's become a deeply polarized medium, where echo chambers and ideological extremism make meaningful connection harder than ever. To help us understand what's happening, we're joined by Dr. Andres Reiljan, a political scientist at the European University Institute. Andres, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Hi Gareth, thank you for the invitation. Very excited to be here.
Before we get into it, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how you came to this area of expertise?
Sure, I'm a political scientist, so I study, politics and especially people's attitudes and feelings about politics. Political polarization has been my central topic, and especially affective polarization. Maybe we get more to it later what it means, but put it simply, it's polarization in feelings towards your political opponents, your political in-groups. So I work on that. I started with it 10 years ago when I went to European University Institute in Florence, Italy to do my PhD. So I got a bit interested in it before while I was studying in Estonia, where I'm from, a small country in Eastern Europe. So I was thinking, how can we measure polarization better so that they can be compared? So like also Eastern European countries that are not so ideologically structured, that we can compare them better with like Western democracies. Over the last 10 years, I defended my PhD. Meanwhile, in 2021, now I'm a researcher still at the European University Institute and also in the University of Tartu in Estonia. So for the last 10 years, I'm working on this polarization topic, predominantly that.
Yeah, cool. And I think that you've just alluded to effective polarization there a couple of times. To get us started, can you give us an explanation of what effective polarization is and what it commonly looks like?
Yeah, sure. Well, as I said, essentially it is polarization in feelings. So it means that you have positive feelings towards some group, that is called, let's say, the in-group, and negative feelings towards some other group, the out-group. So usually the groups in the political science are political parties. It means that you like your own party a lot and you really dislike or even hate some other party, and also maybe even people who vote for that party. So essentially this means that society and politics is divided into groups that mutually dislike and distrust each other. It can have many implications on society. So it essentially can look like that in a Christmas dinner, families get into conflict because some of them are liberals, others are conservatives, and they have very strong feelings about some polarizing political figures, and Christmas dinner ends early. Or that you don't want to be friends with people who support a party you dislike, you don't want to date with them. There's a big research on that too. Essentially, maybe you don't even want to live next to them. There is some data also showing that people are segregating into neighborhoods. You don't want to see the art sign of a party you don't like next to your house. So in the end it looks like a divided society, and then divided politics, and divided also in terms of feelings. So it is possible to disagree with each other respectfully. You think this about this ideological issue, I think that, but we don't hate each other. But effective polarization means that you also really dislike each other.
Right. It's interesting that it does obviously have so much of its focal area within politics, because as we all know and we all see everywhere, like politics seems to be just encompassing everything. Like depending on where you are in the world, the impact that it's having on that polarization is completely extreme. So it's interesting that there's all those different degrees within that. But with so much of that polarization having its roots in politics, is there a reason why politics become the nucleus for polarization that it has?
I think we have to consider the motivations of people. So I think politics is very much the nucleus because it's a competition. People want to, in democracies, different groups of people want to win power, and then they want to spread their message, and there are competing groups. So as a regular person not involved in politics at all, you don't really have much of a motivation to to do polarizing stuff, but as a politician, as someone who is very engaged in politics, you might have this motivation. I think politicians might often misperceive. They think that polarizing strategies are the key to success. Sometimes they are not necessarily so, but often, I think it comes from this motivation to gain power, essentially. And this is the essence of politics, and I think this is why politics is so central in it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point around I guess the interest in gaining power. And I think we could draw parallels with that in the way that as we get further through this discussion around polarization in the digital space as well, there's obviously a power dynamic there too. But before we move on even from politics, can you break down the differences between party effective polarization and leader effective polarization, and what some key examples of those might be?
Sure. That's something I worked on, like to compare how people feel about parties as organizations, as groups of people, and towards specific leaders. Of course, in most established kind of consolidated democracies, the two are quite correlated. They are quite similar. So obviously, you connect the person who is the leader of the party, you connect them with the party. So if you're asked how you feel about them, your feeling is quite similar, but they are not identical. Some leaders can be especially polarizing, even more than the party. Others, the other way around. Maybe a good example could be 2020 US election, where, unsurprisingly, Donald Trump, very polarizing character. So data also showed that the Democratic voters, they hated Trump more than they hated the Republican Party. Whereas for Republicans, it was the other way around. They hated the Democratic Party more than Joe Biden as a person. So I think that kind of shows, that Trump as a character was much more polarizing. Of course, they're still correlated, but they're not completely the same. And maybe in some countries that do not have such a structured party system, actually just approaching it via leaders is much more useful. Like in Brazil, if you ask about feelings towards parties, you don't really get much. It's not such a structured party system. You have to ask, how do you feel about Bolsonaro, the previous president, how you feel about Lula, the current president, and then you get the better picture of it. So they are often very similar, but still distinct concepts, let's say. I can get more scientific about it, but I think it will get more boring.
No, I think that's pretty clear on the connection between some people may just hate a group as a whole, or as you've highlighted, there's certain figureheads like Donald Trump, as everybody knows, he's probably the most polarizing person on the planet. And I think that we could draw so much of the content and themes for this episode back to everything that comes out of America, especially in the digital space, around how that polarization is so driven by politics, which is driven by that man. But all of that said, what would you say regarding polarization? What would you say is the biggest misconception people have about it, or how it's caused, whether that's offline in the real world or in an online space?
I would say I would give you two misconceptions. Let's say one about how things are and other about how things should be. So about misconception about how things are regarding polarization is that people tend to think that different groups of voters or ideological groups, that they are much more extreme than they actually are and much more homogeneous than they actually are. So you think that your outgroup, especially this goes towards the outgroup, so the party and the party supporters that you do not like. So you think that their views, and this is a very common phenomenon, people think that their views are more extreme and also kind of more unified, whereas actually many people are rather centrist. And even within these party groups, maybe you listen to some very polarizing leader, but if you look at the millions of people who vote for the party, they are not so homogeneous, and on average, they are not that extreme. So that is one misconception. People think that the kind of ideological polarization is higher than it actually is, and then also that polarizes them effectively against others, because they think they are more different than they actually are. And maybe the other one, how things should be, that I think is important to outline here, is that there's like a linearity assumption, meaning that more polarization always means worse. And in reality, it's not that simple. So I would rather suggest to think of it as a U-curve, as in very low polarization is problematic because it means that people just don't care at all, and politics is totally pointless. And very high polarization comes problematic because of these things that I mentioned about people starting to hate each other, all of that. So it's more about finding the right amount of polarization. The least polarized country in the world is probably North Korea, because no polarization is allowed, and that's definitely not the role model, right? So I think a misconception is that this term is almost always used in a negative meaning, but we have to think of it in a bit more nuanced way. It's not always that just less polarization good, more polarization bad. It depends on the context and on the levels. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What would be an example of, say, a positive benefit of polarization?
Essentially, if you talk about ideological polarization, it's that people have a more clearly differentiated competing policy packages. You go to the election, if there's no polarization, then based on what do you vote? But it kind of makes voting and making an informed decision easier. If you have, let's say, a left-wing party that offers a clearly defined left-wing view of how they want to govern, and then a right-wing party that offers a clearly defined right-wing view, and then people can choose between that. And then a bit more controversial thing is that there is quite some evidence also on affective polarization that more polarized people are more likely to vote, actually, because they care, So it's not always good. Let's say it's not the best motivation to vote, the affective polarization. If you really vote based on hate, which many people do, voting against a candidate, it's not perfect, but there is some evidence, that in the Western democracies, election turnouts were decreasing over the decades. Every decade, generally, people voted less and less, but now in the last decade, it has turned around a bit, like voting turnouts are again increasing, and this can be tied to heightened polarization. People are more engaged, they care more. So there can be some positive aspects, but again, it's about finding this sweet spot, I would say, where people are polarized enough to care, to engage in politics, to vote, but not so polarized that they completely hate each other.
Yeah, that's a great point around that turnaround there over the last decade, and I think that kind of leads on to my next question, and it would make a lot of sense actually. Over the last decade, as we've seen the rise of so many new forms of social media and algorithms curating, and they're kind of driven by making people mad. And the madder you are, the more passionate you are, the more likely you are to go out and vote. But that said, a lot of people claim that algorithms themselves are the cause of polarization in the world, which, as you've outlined, it just isn't truly the case, but surely they do have a huge impact on it. Do you believe that algorithms are amplifying a natural tendency for us to go towards bad news or rage-inducing news? Like, what do algorithms do to make us angry that's kind of already in us?
Yeah, I agree that they don't cause polarization as such, but they enhance it. So indeed, they push people towards outrage. And in social media, also acting on this outrage, you can very quickly type something, and that's what the algorithms want. They want to get you engaged and react. But then again, like, what are algorithms? Who created them? Who invented them? Humans did. Behind these algorithms, behind this agenda that is pushed on people, that polarizes them, are humans with their human agendas, different groups of people who compete for power, who want to push their different agendas. So yeah, I would say that algorithms are used to enhance it, but they don't just invent it out of thin air. You can see on internet different videos about acts of kindness and people coming together. They can also get a lot of attention, and many people also like that. So it's not algorithms as such. It's rather who controls them and who pushes the agenda, which are people.
Yeah, that makes total sense too, that algorithms as a part of social media and the digital landscape are simply another tool to do the same sort of thing that media or any kind of news and communication has been able to do for centuries, which is kind of fire up certain people and make someone else the other, and make people hate or make people love. So there is definitely obviously a bit of both there. Like, we are naturally predisposed to a bit of polarization. It's not the cause, the internet is not causing it, but it's definitely exacerbating that offline polarization, maybe condensing it into a much more focused delivery method when we are just looking at our screen. Would you say that there's any other problems that algorithms and this incessant stream of negativity and outrage-inducing content that people are viewing online is creating? Like, what is that doing to people in a political sense and beyond?
One thing that I would bring out here is that algorithms and especially social media, where information moves very fast, it is very good for spreading misinformation. And what that does, that enhances what I would say is the most clearly negative and problematic type of polarization, which is what is sometimes in research called factual belief polarization. So it means that not only do we just disagree on how things should be, like left wing, right wing, that's normal, right? But we also disagree on actual facts, like whether climate change is real and caused by humans, what is the actual economic indicators, stuff like that. And this is, I think, where social media and social media algorithms help a lot. Again, it's not only that media already polarized before the internet era in the 90s, but just kind of, this velocity, this kind of huge reach the social media gives to it really helps with this very, very bad cause of polarizing people also over how things are. And this is a very big problem because you cannot really have a normal democratic debate about competing worldviews if people just believe completely different things. If some people believe that climate change is real and caused by humans and others believe that it is a hoax. Things about vaccines, great example there. Like we can have researchers who developed great vaccines, but if lots of people are informed about them making you autistic or stuff like that, they don't want to take these vaccines. I see this as a very, very problematic implication of social media, this enhancing the factual belief polarization.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Factual belief polarization. I think that the way that digital channels, whether it's social media or even the internet in general, where we can go wherever we want to and look at what we want to, it just lets us curate our own information bubble and our own reality, where those, not a common set of facts, the opposite of that, like parallel narratives, potentially lead us to lose the skills to engage with people who disagree with us. What would you say people should keep in mind when they see something that outrages them so much that all they want to do is hate that person? What should they keep in mind, and how should they approach somebody with what they see as a viewpoint so different to their own?
I listened to your previous podcast with John Dedekis, and I think he made a great point about curiosity, like have curiosity. And I would say that also, instead of just immediately getting outraged, have curiosity about how these people that you disagree with so strongly, how did they reach these views that they had? Is it because they are very evil or very stupid, or is it because they see totally different information than you do? Is it because they have very different moral groundings? Doesn't mean that they're evil people, but you have kind of conservative religious roots of morals, you have secular humanistic roots of morals. So think about that. Think, how do they reach these views, and is it really that they're evil as people, or could there be something more there? And be curious. I mean, when I talk to people who I disagree with, I try to rather ask questions from them and figure out why do they think what they think, rather than immediately thinking how to dunk on them or say no, that's stupid and you have to change your mind. But unfortunately, social media very much pushes this dunking on the outgroup culture, that it's if you want to gain a big following, you cannot have a detailed debate. It's rather you have a 1-2-liner where you make your opponent look very stupid, and that's rewarded there more. And I would say, in that sense, maybe also don't use social media that much would be one of the suggestions.
Yeah, there's a couple of good points in there, especially one around the way to build a following is to be just so extreme in whatever you're doing that it becomes a kind of a magnet for other people that might believe, say, a small fragment of whatever you're saying. But I think with that in mind, we know that some people have just such gigantic amounts of followings. They're responsible for a disproportionate amount of messaging being communicated between people, which, as you said, a few minutes ago, makes things seem so much more polarized than they actually are when you're just seeing these extreme versions of everything hitting you in the face. Is that a uniquely digital space problem, or is it the same offline in the real world as well, where a few loud voices get a disproportionate amount of attention? Now, we know one of those would be Donald Trump. Is he just a unique case, or is this something that humans just tend to happen through charisma, would you say?
Yeah, I think it is. There are parallels to it. Like, again, internet changes a bit the form of these kind of loud voices, gives them easier ways to get this reach. But no, it reflects a more general turn in politics. It has changed over time. Like usually you had that politicians rather avoid saying controversial stuff. They try to say things that make them look competent, professional. But then nowadays it's much more common that politicians try to stick out by saying stuff that is very controversial. But then it's not only internet phenomenon, but there are also, let's say, polarizers in a more broad sense. Of course, I would say that nowadays separating between the online and offline world is not anymore that simple. They are the same people who do stuff offline and online often, but the kind of polarizing impulse very much comes from smaller, more engaged, more extreme, more partisan people. And they are there offline and online.
How would you say that governments or organizations or even platforms use the mechanics of polarization to either achieve their own goals or sabotage their enemies? And are these tactics the same whether you're doing it offline or online, or do they change with the medium? What works better?
Here it's very important to clarify which kind of governments we mean. I would very much emphasize here the governments of dictatorships. Russia, China. There is a lot of evidence how Russia is supporting extremists in different Western democracies, often extremists on both sides. So extreme right, extreme left. They do a lot to enhance polarization because it essentially weakens the democracies, the Western democracies that they see as the enemies. And it has proven to be a good strategy, I would say, for countries like Russia. Consider here I am from Estonia, bordering Russia, so I don't have good feelings for this country, but there is a lot of evidence of Russia using these polarization tactics to kind of to divide Western democracies, and the internet is giving them a lot of good tools for that. There are the troll farms, people who just sit somewhere in a basement and post polarizing stuff all day long. Lots of fake users, bots created by Russia. I see this kind of a strategic use mostly there, and it's kind of in a way an international thing, as in like governments of dictatorships use it, because in dictatorship you don't really deal with polarization, because you don't have the competition is not allowed, so it in a way makes them more efficient in some terms. So they try to use the weaknesses of democracies, and the more polarized, especially emotionally polarized, they manage to make us, the better for them. That the weaker is their enemy. So I would say there is a lot of this strategical use, but I to me the most, I could also talk about how governments use it within countries, in democracies, but I think the most important part here is this kind of dictatorships working against democracies. I would emphasize that.
I'd be interested to hear how governments use it within democracies as well.
Well, again, I don't want to always go back to US, but I think you see very well how Trump is using it. You try to get yourself off the leash and blame it on someone else. And the more polarized is the electorate, the more they hate the opponent, the more prone they are to believe it. And essentially, and what is the most dangerous phenomenon there is that they can use this kind of a strong polarization to dismantle democracy. And from this we can also use examples like Hungary, Turkey, countries that have massively backslided in their democracy over the last 10-15 years. And they are very polarized. Also data shows they're really polarized. So the leaders, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, they can rely on their voters really hating the other side. And if you really hate the other side, you are more cool. Even if you generally support democracy, you're kind of more cool to violating different rules of democracy when it favors your party. So this has been used a lot. You frame it kind of as something that we have to do to win, to not let the hated out party in power. And that's what many governments use, and there's good examples, essentially bad examples of that all over the world, so not only USA.
No, for sure. And again, it's interesting that you just mentioned that same time frame, 10 to 15 years. And I think that through all of these examples, yes, we know that social media plays a huge part in that, because it's kind of, a one-to-one conversation. Like, you can make people so angry on their own. They're just kind of in their zone, looking at their feed. But while people blame algorithms and social media and even the internet for this polarization and the way that people just can't find that common ground anymore, they're still just tools and methods for humans to use. So it's not so much the method or the medium creating this polarization. It's almost just relaying a message, and I guess the way it delivers it can assist with that polarization, which is quite interesting. And I'd love to, maybe look into more why it's got so much worse over that last 10 to 15 years. Is there a direct correlation there with the massive explosion of just so much more social media over that time, or is that just a coincidence, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because there is quite some conflicting evidence on that. Polarization is quite a complicated concept, actually. So how different scholars measure it differs. That really drives the results. So it's not so simple. It's not that social media comes, polarization increases. But let's say I am rather in the camp that yes, it has increased it and will, unless something changes, will keep increasing it. There is also clear evidence that it's echo chambers that social media allows and pushes for, that they do polarize people. So those who are more in social media echo chambers are more polarized. But at the same time, of course, I agree with you that essentially these are tools, and there are also structural reasons. What also happened around 15 years ago, a bit more even now, was the great economic crisis that started in 2008. Many people lost a lot in their life quality. So at the same time, rise of this kind of what we call the cultural issues, like say the woke and the anti-woke, all of that. It's enhanced by social media, by internet, but there are actual topics there that have just risen. This just make people very angry about stuff. If economy tanks, you don't feel good about it. And even more so, this rise of just to say what is called cultural issues, essentially these kind of things like LGBT rights, abortion rights, immigration, immigrants' rights, all of these topics that kind of go into our core beliefs, moral foundations. These are real topics, they are not invented by internet, and these have also massively increased over the last decades. I think social media contributes to it because these are like in a way simpler topics. It's easier to take a strong stance than trans rights or abortion rights in social media than to start discussing the details of a taxation system, and whether the marginal rate of the richest people should be 5% higher or lower. That just doesn't engage as much as just kind of things that go to our rights, our moral foundations. So again, I would say internet as a tool contributes to it, but there are also other more structural reasons of this polarization that we are experiencing in especially last 10-15 years.
Yeah, look, there's a couple of really good things in there that make so much sense. One, first of which was obviously we can draw that line back to 2008. And even like the Occupy Wall Street movement that came out of that, and in my own reading and looking into things, all of those cultural issues, or as they call it, culture war stuff, it all just came and got so big, conveniently taking the heat off what Occupy Wall Street was kind of focused on, which was just how bad this system had shafted basically everybody. You said something quite interesting there that makes a lot of sense, that in the social media or digital realm, you're not really spending time when you're scrolling, you're getting mad at stuff, but it is just like junk food issues. It's like you can read it very quickly, get angry, look for the next one. As you said, no one's scrolling through their Instagram or TikTok or whatever is trying to unravel like a complicated tax system. They just want something to get really angry at. And whether it is just trying to find that other, that outsider to put the blame on, it's a very, very effective tool to kind of distract from everything else that's going on. That's a huge other conversation. Does that kind of anger then generate in an online space and then spill out offline? I can probably count on one hand the amount of people I've ever encountered in my life that might have been so insanely passionate against abortion, for instance. But if you go anywhere online, it's like there's thousands of them everywhere. The offline space is a lot more in the shades of grey, in the middle. We can all kind of get along and find that common ground and common humanity with each other. So I guess we could say that the internet and the digital world is having a real effect on breaking our ability to find a shared beliefs or reality, etc., with other people, which, is not great. But that said, would you say that the idea of common ground itself is perhaps a naive or outdated concept in the modern world? especially since we're just surrounded and bombarded by so much more information and so much more fragmentation of information. It's not like a couple of 100 years ago, you live in a town, everyone else lives in the town, you all do the same thing. Now we've all got infinite amounts of inputs into our life. So being more unique than ever, are we kidding ourselves that we should just be able to find something in common with everybody?
Good question. And no, I don't think it's a naive idea. What we have to think of is that we can disagree on different issues, different political issues, lifestyle choices. We have to just find a way to deal with it. But there is still a lot of agreement on more abstract kind of things. And I think the most important common ground, and again, when we talk about polarization, divisions, we usually talk about democracies, or at least countries where you have competitive elections, right? And I think this is the very crucial common ground, is that most people in all across the democratic world, most people support democracy as the best form of government. They support media freedom, they support judicial freedom, general freedom of speech. People might understand these concepts a bit differently. They might think that their opponents are against it, and they might think, both say often that, it's the other side who is, censoring. There is some truth to it in some cases on both sides, but overall, there is a common ground on that. And in the light of who are those who want us to be divided and weak, which are countries like Russia and China. Especially in the face of that, I think we have to find this common ground. We have to find ways that we understand that some of us are liberals and very secular people, others are conservatives and very religious people, but we all have to agree that we want to live in a democracy. And there is a lot of common ground on that, and I think that's very much a message that I would like to also to reflect more in the online space, is that most people do want to live in democracies.
It's such a great point there around, I do wish that team that I potentially don't like all the best because I want the country to succeed. And one of the things that I've noticed, especially, say over the last 10 years, is that there's so many people actively wanting the country to fail when their team is not the one in charge. You said it earlier about dunking on people. Everything is just dunking, except the stakes at like a national government level is just so insanely high that I don't know why anybody would wish for their country to fail just to dunk on the party that they didn't vote for. That just seems crazy to me, and that is definitely a result of, I would say, this increased polarization that's being driven by these algorithms, and then potentially like bad actors getting in there and sowing havoc amongst things. Hopefully we can get to a point where people kind of go, all right, well, what's best for us as a country, and everybody in every country where they can do that. I won't hold my breath. All of that said, we know if people are spending so much time online, it's so polarized, and it's now in the real world and it's so polarized. What would you say the psychological toll of just being constantly exposed to such polarization, whether it's political or anything else? What's the toll of that on an individual and maybe even at a societal level? Yeah, there is actually some solid data from it also, that it does have a psychological toll. Like before the 2024 election in US, the psychological studies about stress in America showed that around 70% of Americans stated the upcoming election as a source of stress in their lives. So they're stressed about how it will go, who it will win, what will happen then if the other side wins. I cannot say that, that polarized people are always more stressed and less happy than the people who don't really care about politics. Not necessarily, but overall there is good data showing that it stresses people out, and it has a toll then on the whole society. If you have loads of people stressed about the election as if we don't have enough stuff to be stressed about already. And yeah, as I said before, then it kind of drives us into mutually hating groups, which is essentially bad for society. I think many people would agree with that. Yeah, for sure.
So you have a lot of stressed people who maybe get some short-term hits from these moments in social media. But yeah, as you also said, I think social media is like a internet equivalent of, or information equivalent of junk food. So yeah, you might enjoy when you eat it for a moment, but it's not good for you.
Knowing everything that you know around polarization and the mechanics behind it and the science behind it, for those people who might be feeling overwhelmed and stressed by just the amount of conflict they're encountering, whether it's in their digital life or their real life, their offline life. What do you reckon that they can do to help them break free of that and start looking for common ground with their quote unquote opposition?
Well, yeah, maybe what we already discussed a bit before was like have curiosity, acknowledge your own biases, think about whether you want to live in a democracy or not, and if you want to live in a democracy, how can we reconcile things with our opponents? But at the same time, it's difficult just as an individual endeavor. I think there has to be societal measures, to drive this kind of a bringing us together. And there are ways. I've worked on it myself. I've developed a chatbot that we just tested in Poland, where they had a very polarized election, where we mapped out people's misperceptions about the others and then corrected them. So we asked people like, what do you think voters of that party think about this issue? And then we corrected their misperception. And then those who got this, we call it a treatment, like experimental treatment. Those who used it, they significantly hated the out party voters less. So the affective polarization decreased. There are several examples in the US also of similar research. So I would say seek out like a non-partisan neutral information about different sides in politics with an open mind. But for that also researchers have to make themselves and their content more heard. So in a way, for an individual perspective, seek out information, but then also from the societal perspective, we have to make this information available. So yeah, I would say politics, society and politicians and researchers and all kinds of people who want the world to be better, they have to contribute to it together, and then individuals can find more information that helps them understand some biases better.
Yeah, for sure. And just to finish up then, as we look ahead, you've just mentioned that chatbot that you've built. So that's, using technology and the internet to counteract this polarization, the loss of the common ground. And I think that we were here today to look at whether technology was solely to blame for the current situation, as so many people claim it is, which it clearly isn't by that. But it sounds like what you're doing is you're actually now using it to try and solve a problem that it may not be directly responsible for, but it can play a part in directly solving. How do you see this chatbot evolving from here, and what are some of the potential outcomes of it?
Yeah, essentially internet might be, and social media, all of it might be behind, partly at least, and I think is, in this increase in polarization, but also we cannot go back to the pre-internet era. We cannot start tackling traffic accidents by going back to horses. So even if internet is to blame, there is no way, I would say, no other way. There are also other ways, but definitely the internet has to be also part of this, tackling this. What I will do in the coming years, do a lot of research in developing more of these kind of tools to see like what kind of mechanisms trigger this especially effective polarization, and then how can we counteract it and reduce it, and also how to improve people's attitudes towards democracy, so that they would be less willing to accept norm violations from their leaders, from their party leaders. I will work a lot on that. So yeah, I see that there is a way to use online tools, internet also for the good. And I've been actually working on this kind of stuff like voting advice applications where people can learn about candidates. I've been working on it actually for over 10 years as a side thing, and now I start connecting it with the polarization topic, like how can they be used to reduce this kind of a negative toxic types of polarization. So I hope it will go into promising and fruitful directions, and if I find something interesting, I will surely try to communicate it through all kinds of media.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds really cool. Where can people follow what you're up to with that? Is there any way that they can see what's happening, or is it it just needs to come out with the research as it happens?
I have not invested much into like building a personal brand. I usually kind of let my research speak for myself, although maybe I should go more in this direction. I really don't like social media very much. Yeah, I would say that if you're interested in my research, go to my Google Scholar profile and read my articles. If some of them are behind the paywall, drop me an email. I will happily share with you a PDF. And yeah, I will definitely, if I find something interesting, I will go to media with it and try to kind of spread the good word about the potential of common ground
Good word. That's what we like to hear. A lot to think about there, and you've really showed us so much around what actually is causing that polarization in not just a social digital space, but in a real world as well. Andres, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Gareth. It was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed the talk.
For more info on what we've discussed today, check out the show notes. If you enjoyed this one, you can subscribe to Ruined by the Internet on your favourite podcast app and help spread the word by sharing this episode or leaving a review. I'm Gareth King. See you next time.